I remember the exact second the mirror stopped feeling like an object and started feeling like a question. It was late, the house unusually quiet, and I was standing in my sister's room holding something that wasn't meant for me, not forbidden, just unfamiliar. The weight of it in my hands felt heavier than it should have, like it carried expectations I hadn't agreed to but couldn't ignore. The idea had started casually, almost jokingly. A week. Just a week. A practical favor wrapped in humor and sibling trust. I told myself it was about helping out, about stepping in, about convenience. But even as I said yes, something inside me leaned forward, alert in a way I didn't recognize. Curiosity mixed with nerves, and neither one backed down. The first time I changed, I moved carefully, as if the room itself might react. Every sound felt amplified. My thoughts raced ahead of my hands, asking questions I didn't yet know how to answer. I avoided the mirror at first, focusing on the process instead of the result, telling myself this was temporary, observational, neutral. When I finally looked up, my breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition. The reflection didn't feel like a costume. It felt like a version of me I'd never been introduced to. The room stayed quiet. The mirror didn't judge. It just reflected, patiently. That was the moment I realized the week ahead wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't going to be just about appearances or logistics. Something had already shifted, and I hadn't even stepped outside yet. Morning arrived before I felt ready for it. I woke with that disorienting sense of having slept somewhere unfamiliar, even though I hadn't moved an inch. For a few seconds, I forgot. Then memory rushed back in, not as panic, but as awareness. The plan. The week. The quiet agreement I'd made without fully understanding its weight. Getting ready felt different in daylight. The confidence from the night before thinned, replaced by careful attention. I noticed how my movements changed when I slowed down, how intention replaced habit. Nothing was rushed. Every choice felt deliberate, as if I were learning a new language through motion rather than words. The mirror appeared again, unavoidable now. In the softer light of morning, the reflection felt more vulnerable. Less cinematic, more real. I searched for myself in it, half expecting to feel like an imposter. Instead, I felt exposed in a strangely honest way, like standing without armor for the first time. That scared me more than pretending ever had. Stepping out of the room was the real test. The hallway felt longer. Sounds felt sharper. I was suddenly aware of how visible a body can feel even when no one is looking directly at it. Every step carried a question. Can I do this? Not just today, but for the rest of the week. And beneath that question, quieter but persistent, another one formed. What if I don't want it to end? I took a breath, steadied myself, and kept walking. The week had officially begun. The first day passed in fragments rather than a clean line. Small interactions lingered longer than they should have. A glance held half a second extra. A voice shifted without instruction. I became aware of how much of daily life is performance, not deception, but adaptation, and how quickly the body learns new cues when it's allowed to. There was tension in the ease. Every time something felt natural, I waited for the catch. I expected discomfort to reclaim its place, to remind me this wasn't mine. But it didn't. Instead, I felt a quiet focus, like balancing on something narrow and discovering that balance itself can be calming. At one point, alone again, I caught sight of myself reflected faintly in a window. The image was imperfect, layered with the outside world, and that made it feel more believable. I didn't look away. I studied the outline, the posture, the way I held space differently. It wasn't dramatic, but it was distinct. The recurring object became clear that afternoon. Not the clothes, not the room, but the mirror itself. It followed me everywhere, not physically, but in memory. Each reflective surface felt like a question mark, asking not who I was pretending to be, but who I was allowing myself to see. By evening, fatigue set in, not physical, but emotional. Holding awareness takes effort. I sat with that tiredness and realized it wasn't regret. It was growth. And growth, I was learning, asks to be felt. As I prepared for the night, I didn't rush. I didn't avoid the mirror this time. I stood in front of it longer than necessary, letting the day settle into the reflection. Something inside me softened. I went to bed with the sense that the week wasn't just unfolding, it was shaping me. The second morning began with resistance, not fear, but hesitation. The novelty had worn off just enough to reveal the stakes. This wasn't a secret experiment anymore. It was a rhythm forming. I noticed how easily I slipped back into it, and that ease unsettled me. I'd always believed change was supposed to feel loud, obvious. This felt quiet, almost domestic. I caught myself humming while getting ready, the same absent-minded tune my sister used to play when she thought no one was listening. The realization stopped me mid-note. I laughed under my breath, embarrassed and oddly comforted. It wasn't imitation, not really. It was proximity. When you live close to someone long enough, their habits brush off on you. Outside, the world continued as if nothing extraordinary were happening. That was both a relief and a disappointment. I'd half expected the day to challenge me more directly, to force a reckoning. Instead, it offered neutrality. And neutrality, I learned, leaves room for introspection. There was a moment in the afternoon when someone used a name that wasn't mine, not mistakenly, just practically. It landed softly, like a pebble dropped into still water. The ripple spread slowly. I answered without thinking, and only later realized what I'd done. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with a strange warmth I didn't yet have language for. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again, searching for answers it had never promised to give. I saw someone standing straighter than before, eyes steadier, expression less guarded. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew I was paying attention now. And once you start paying attention, it's hard to stop. Midweek arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, and that alone felt significant. I realized I'd stopped counting hours and started measuring days by feeling instead. Each morning carried less resistance, less internal negotiation. Not because the questions were gone, but because I was no longer afraid of asking them. There was a social moment that day that caught me off guard. Nothing dramatic. Just a shared laugh, an easy exchange that didn't require explanation or adjustment. I felt present in it, fully there, not monitoring myself from a distance. When it ended, I felt a brief rush of joy followed immediately by fear, as if I'd wandered too far from something familiar and might not find my way back. That fear followed me home. I sat with it, let it speak. It wasn't warning me to stop. It was asking me to be careful, with myself, with what this might mean. I understood then that self-acceptance isn't a switch, it's a negotiation that keeps evolving. The mirror waited, as it always did. This time, I didn't approach it with questions. I approached it with curiosity. I noticed how my expression had softened, how tension no longer lived permanently in my shoulders. I looked like someone who belonged in their own body, even if the story wasn't finished yet. That night, the familiar tune returned, the one I'd been humming without realizing. It felt like a thread connecting days together, proof that continuity was forming. I didn't stop the melody. I let it carry me forward. Half the week was gone. And instead of relief, I felt something closer to resolve. The fourth day challenged me in a new way, not with fear, but with reflection from the outside. Someone who knew my sister well paused mid-sentence, studied me for a moment, then smiled in a way that suggested familiarity rather than confusion. It wasn't about resemblance. It was about energy. The way I listened. The way I occupied silence. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. I replayed it, searching for cracks, for signs of performance slipping. Instead, I found consistency. I wasn't acting anymore. I was responding. and that realization made everything feel heavier and lighter at the same time. Later, alone, the mirror felt different again. Not a checkpoint, not a question, more like a witness. I spoke out loud for the first time, not rehearsed, not explanatory. Just a sentence about the day, said in my own voice as it existed now. Hearing it echo back grounded me in a way I didn't expect. There was still tension, of course. I caught myself wondering how this would look from the outside, how I'd explain it if asked directly. The thought tightened my chest. But then it loosened, replaced by something steadier. I didn't owe anyone the whole story yet. I was still reading it myself. As evening settled in, I realized I hadn't thought about the end of the week all day. The deadline that once loomed had faded into the background. That scared me, then reassured me. It meant I was present. It meant I was learning. I went to sleep with a quiet sense of pride, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Just a recognition, I was handling this. And that mattered. The fifth morning carried a strange calm, the kind that usually arrives after a decision has already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought. I noticed it in how I breathed, how my reflection met my eyes without flinching. The mirror no longer startled me. It greeted me like a familiar room. That day brought the first real moment of conflict. A casual question, innocent on the surface, landed heavier than expected. How long are you staying like this? It wasn't accusatory. It was curious. Still, it pressed on something tender. I felt the old instinct rise, to deflect, to joke, to shrink the truth until it fit comfortably in someone else's expectations. Instead, I paused. The silence stretched, not awkwardly, just long enough to feel deliberate. I answered honestly without explaining everything. A simple response. A boundary. The relief that followed surprised me. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't apologized. I just existed. Later, alone again, the emotional weight caught up with me. Pride and fear tangled together, neither winning. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, and let the feeling pass through instead of pushing it away. That was new. I realized how often I'd treated emotions like obstacles instead of signals. The recurring song returned softly in my head, slower this time, almost reflective. It felt like a marker, proof that I was still me, even as something expanded. I didn't feel split anymore. I felt layered. As night settled, I looked at the calendar without counting days. The end of the week was approaching, but it no longer felt like an escape hatch. It felt like a question waiting patiently for an answer I was still learning how to form. The sixth day arrived with a quiet gravity, like the air before a meaningful conversation. I felt it while tying my shoes, while smoothing fabric, while catching my reflection in places I no longer tried to avoid. The mirror had become less of a guide and more of a companion, present, steady, unremarkable in the best way. I spent more time outside that day, letting the world brush past me without flinching. There were moments of self-consciousness, yes, but they didn't spiral. They passed like weather. I noticed how much energy I used to spend bracing myself, and how freeing it felt to stop doing that, even briefly. An unexpected kindness caught me off guard, a small gesture, offered without ceremony. It wasn't about approval. It was about recognition. I carried it with me longer than necessary, replaying it in my head, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to understand why it mattered so much. I realized it wasn't the gesture itself. It was the ease of it. By evening, the weight of the week pressed in again. The knowledge that this chapter had an end date resurfaced, sharper now. I stood in front of the mirror and tried to imagine stepping out of this rhythm, returning to the before. The image felt distant, like recalling a place I once lived but no longer recognized. I didn't feel panic. I felt honesty. The kind that doesn't demand action immediately, only acknowledgement. I whispered the truth to myself, not a conclusion, just an observation, and felt steadier for having said it. 1 day left. And instead of counting what I'd lose, I found myself considering what I'd keep. Would you like to continue to the next part? Next. Part 9. The final morning didn't feel like an ending. It felt like standing on a threshold, aware of both rooms at once. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if each action carried a small echo. The mirror met me without ceremony, reflecting someone who looked settled. Not finished. Just real. I noticed the details I'd once obsessed over no longer demanded attention. Instead, I felt tuned into posture, presence, the way confidence doesn't announce itself but hums quietly underneath everything else. The song in my head returned, softer now, like it knew this moment mattered and didn't want to interrupt it. There was a conversation I'd been avoiding all week, and it found me anyway. It wasn't dramatic. No declarations. Just honesty delivered in measured sentences, each one chosen with care. I didn't tell the whole story. I didn't need to. I shared enough to feel aligned with myself, and that was new territory. The response wasn't perfect, but it was human. I could work with that. Later, alone again, I let the weight of the week settle fully. I sat on the floor and allowed pride to surface, not the loud kind, but the earned kind. I'd shown up. I'd stayed present. I hadn't abandoned myself when things felt complicated. As the day leaned toward evening, the question returned, not who am I, but what do I carry forward? The answer wasn't a list. It was a feeling, a steadiness, a permission I'd granted myself without realizing it. The threshold waited. I took a breath and stepped closer, not rushing, not retreating, just ready. That evening stretched longer than usual, as if time itself was giving me space to decide how to hold everything I'd lived through. I packed nothing away at first. I left things where they were, not out of avoidance, but out of respect. This week had earned that much. I sat with the stillness and noticed how my body felt when I wasn't bracing for the next moment. The mirror caught me again, almost accidentally. I hadn't gone looking for it, which felt important. I stood there, hands relaxed at my sides, and realized I no longer felt the urge to analyze. The reflection didn't ask me to choose between versions of myself. It simply reflected continuity. I saw someone who had learned how to stand without shrinking. There was a flicker of grief then, not sharp, but present. Grief for the years I'd spent assuming certain feelings had expiration dates, or that curiosity was something to outgrow. I let that grief sit beside the pride instead of pushing it away. They didn't cancel each other out. They shared the space. A message came in, casual, ordinary, and I answered it without recalibrating my tone or second-guessing my words. That small ease felt monumental. It meant I wasn't compartmentalizing anymore. I was integrating. As night settled, I realized I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Not because I had answers, but because I trusted myself to keep asking the right questions. The song in my head played one last time that day, steady and familiar, like a promise rather than a reminder. The week was nearly over. But something in me had clearly begun. Morning arrived without ceremony, and that felt right. No dramatic shift, no sudden clarity, just the quiet continuation of breath and light through the window. I moved through the routine slower than usual, aware that this was the last time it would look exactly like this. That awareness didn't rush me. It steadied me. I made one deliberate choice before anything else. I didn't change right away. I let myself exist as I was, unedited, for a little longer. It wasn't defiance. It was acknowledgement. The mirror reflected someone calm, someone who had learned how to occupy space without apologizing for it. I held that image gently, knowing it wasn't something I'd lose just because circumstances shifted. There was a moment of doubt, quiet, insistent. What if this was only possible here, only now? The thought tightened my chest until another followed, softer but stronger. What if it wasn't? That question opened something. It reframed the entire week not as an exception, but as evidence. Later, as I finally began to transition out of the week's rhythm, I noticed how much of it stayed with me anyway. The posture, the attentiveness, the way I listened before responding. These weren't costumes. They were skills. They belonged to me. I didn't feel like I was putting something away. I felt like I was carrying something forward, quietly, deliberately, without asking permission. The end was close now, and instead of mourning it, I felt prepared to meet it. When the week finally closed, it did so gently, like a door eased shut rather than slammed. I stood in the same room where it had all begun, noticing how different it felt, not because anything was missing, but because something had settled into place. The air felt familiar again, yet I wasn't returning to who I'd been. I was arriving as someone expanded. I took one last look in the mirror, not searching, not evaluating, just recognizing. I saw the courage it had taken to stay present through uncertainty. I saw the softness I'd learned to value instead of hide. I saw a version of myself that no longer needed a specific context to exist. That realization landed quietly and stayed. The recurring song drifted through my mind one final time, then faded without effort. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like completion. The melody had done its job. It had carried me through change until I no longer needed it to remind me who I was becoming. I stepped forward into the rest of my life without ceremony, carrying the week not as a secret or a costume, but as knowledge. Knowledge of how it feels to be aligned. Knowledge that identity isn't something you switch on and off, it's something you listen to, again and again. The story didn't end there. It simply stopped needing to explain itself.